Welcome everybody to our latest seminar for our Mass Observation 85th Anniversary series. Very pleased to have Renelle and Nina here to share their papers today. Just a bit of housekeeping to say that we will be recording the papers, but we won't be recording any of the discussion following. Ben Highmore, who's a trustee of Mass Observation Archive, will be chairing and facilitating the session, and we'll come to any questions afterwards. So if you've got anything that arises during the papers, if you just stick that in the chat, we will pick that up. And yeah, enjoy the session, and I'll hand you over to Ben. Thanks, Ben.
Brilliant. Okay, so yeah, this is mass observation asking difficult questions and presumably kind of responding to difficult questions. If you want to, in the chat, if you want to ask a question after the two papers have been read, you could put a Q in the question, and then we could just go to you and you can answer it live. You don't have to write the whole thing out unless that's what you want to. Okay, so we're going to begin with Renelle McGlacken. I hope I pronounced your name correctly, who is at the moment a research fellow at the University of Nottingham in the School of Sociology and Social Policy, but is soon about to leave academia, maybe only for a while, to take up a post at the RSPCA, which, and given that her research has been around kind of animal research, this seems like a really interesting and great move. So perhaps she could talk to us about that as well later on. Anyway, her paper is called The Ethics of Discomfort, Soliciting Mass Observation Project, Writing on Sensitive Topics. Over to you, Renelle.
Thanks very much, Ben. So I'll share my screen and hope that it does what it should. Yeah, I think it's looking good. So yeah, hi everyone, my name is Renelle. And I'm just going to give a quick overview of how the talk will run. So I'll give a short introduction to myself and how I came to use the Mass Observation Project. I'll briefly consider the definition of sensitive topic. Then I'll introduce the 2016 Using Animals for Research Directive, which I analysed the responses to in my PhD research. Then we'll look at the presence of discomfort in mass obs writing around animal research. And then we'll move on to consider the methodological value of discomfort and also discuss some of the ethical obligations that we might have to mass observers, particularly around how the Mass Observation Project might itself invoke comfort or discomfort in correspondence. And I'll end with some final thoughts and questions around that. So, as said, I'm working in the School of Sociology and Social Policy at the University of Nottingham. I'm a interdisciplinary social scientist interested in socio-ethical aspects of human-animal relationships. And to date, my work has kind of focused on science and medicine in particular. So I completed my PhD in the School of Sociology and Social Policy at the University of Nottingham in 2021, and this was done as part of a Wellcome Trust collaborative programme of research called the Animal Research Nexus, or ANNEX, and that is captured in this wheel diagram here. So my project was part of Project for People and Professions, and this is a picture of us all, or some of us at least, in a bioscience facility at the University of Manchester. So my thesis explored UK societal relations with animal research through an analysis of writing on the topic, which was through the Mass Observation Project. And this is what I'll be talking a bit more about today. My current role as a research fellow, still on the Annex programme and at Nottingham, looks at the role of vets in animal research. But as I said, this talk's mainly based on my PhD work. And as I'll go into shortly, we'll talk about the prevalence of discomfort in writing on the directive on animal research. So to give a disclaimer, this talk will probably raise more questions than give answers, or perhaps it'll be a nice opening for Nina's talk and also the later Mass Obs seminar on the topic of ethics and responsibility. So there's a whole literature on what constitutes a sensitive topic, and that would be really interesting to explore in conversation with mass obs. But here, I just want to begin by describing what this refers to. So Lee and Renzetti define sensitive topics as those which involve particular kinds of costs. And particularly relevant here, these may take the forms of psychic costs, such as guilt, shame, or embarrassment. Relatedly, one of the ways that sensitive is defined in the Oxford English Dictionary is as having the potential to cause alarm, offence, or controversy, or to have serious repercussions. The issue of animal research has long been subject of controversy and socio-ethical concern, and this is nicely illustrated in this photo of members from the London and Provincial Anti-Vivisection Society from 1906. So the sensitivity of animal research has even informed my decisions around what kinds of images to include in today's PowerPoint, thinking about not wanting to make those who are attending too uncomfortable. So this was the 2016 directive on using animals for research that I analysed the responses to in my PhD thesis. The directive was commissioned by my PhD supervisor at University of Nottingham, and it focused particularly on biomedical uses of animals. And I thought about this, maybe this was a way to make the topic more accessible and relatable for the diverse group of respondents on the panel, and as a way of providing a material way into the topic of animal research, allowing observers to draw on their own experiences and views on medicine and health and illness. So rather than this abstract ethical issue, animal research was here presented as something that manifests in everyday life, and the directive featured the three sections categorized by thinking back, everyday life, and policy and practice. So the problem of knowing about animal research. So in my analysis of the mass obs writing, I found that many mass observers articulate this real sense of discomfort around thinking and writing about animal research. And many observers express that the practice raises feelings of sadness, guilt, and shame. So for instance, one mass observer wrote, "Just seeing written or heard said the term laboratory animal research makes me feel very sad. Of course, I realise over many years, cures and treatments for many illnesses, some of which were terminal some years ago, medicines now widely used safely would not have been found without long years of research and experimentation. And probably members of my family, friends and acquaintances have benefited from this research, but the poor animals that have been kept sometimes in poor conditions who cannot speak, but have been used to find some of the cures, make me very emotionally upset." So in order to mediate some of these unpleasant feelings, some mass observers discussed a general avoidance of the topic of animal research and expressed a subsequent ambivalence towards the prospect of more openness from the bioscience sector around animal use. So as the following mass observers write, "As regards buying and taking medicines, I don't think I've ever given the scientific research involving millions of animals a second thought, which I suppose is rather shameful. It's just something I block out, I suppose, back to my feeling of not being able to do anything about it." And another observer writes, "If we were asked flat out, do you approve of secrecy? Are you in favour of greater openness? We would say no and yes. But the truth is that some of us, and some part of all of us, are essentially happy to be kept in the dark about unpleasant things." So going further, a few mass observers expressed that they were unable to write about the topic, apologised for an uncharacteristically brief response, or proclaimed that they would not respond to another directive on this topic. So the first observer wrote, "Sorry, I can't write about this." Another wrote, "Sorry, but this is going to be terribly disappointing. I've never written so little in a directive." And finally, another correspondent wrote, "No animals should be used in research. I don't think animals should be used in research. I'm totally against it. I won't respond if you write about animal testing again. I find it too upsetting." So in analysing this writing, we might consider the methodological value of accessing this discomfort and resistance towards particular research topics. in allowing correspondents to articulate their resistance or ambivalence towards animal research beyond selecting unsure or other tick boxes in surveys or opinion polls which dominate studies of views towards animal research, the Mass Observation Project aids an analysis which grapples with the complexity of feeling towards the practice beyond this binary of support or opposition. Even those who refuse to write something about the topic offer important empirical insights, with the possibility to witness disengagements with the issue and hear, even briefly, something from those who feel unable or unwilling to discuss it being of significant methodological value. In the case of animal research, insights into discomfort around this use of animals and desires not to know about it led me to critique the lack of opportunities that publics have in decision-making processes around scientific animal use, with the responsibility that knowing confers upon publics and the accompanying discomfort of not being able to act on what one comes to know being seen to necessitate this turning away. So if we can't act on it, what's the point of knowing? It becomes futile. As well as benefits for researchers, stimulating discomfort might have value for participants. Though in the context of teaching rather than research, Bowler discusses the value of a pedagogy of discomfort, suggesting that to question the familiar may lead to greater sense of connection, fuller sense of meaning, and in the end, a greater sense of comfort with who we have chosen to be and how we act in our lives. Perhaps we might also consider the transformative potential of what Wolgemuth and Donoghue call an inquiry of discomfort, in which researchers and participants engage in an exploration of values and beliefs. However, with the presence of discomfort across the MOP account, I started to think about what it might be like to receive an email or a letter through the door with prompts and questions about a topic that you might find upsetting or unsettling. This sense of insensitivity in asking mass observers to write about topics which can be upsetting is also reflected on in Tara Bailey's 2012 PhD thesis on funeral attendance, with one of their foremost regrets in using the Mass Observation Project to explore the topic being the pain that was caused to some correspondents. The space that the MOP affords its correspondents to think and write about a topic in their own time might become isolating in regards to certain subjects, and in some ways leave participants alone to grapple with uncomfortable questions. And in writing about researching via an inquiry of discomfort, Wolgemuth and Donoghue state that an inquiry of discomfort must employ an active empathy. This active empathy takes on many features of person-centered counselling, such as active listening, approaching individuals with unconditional positive regard, and respecting. So in thinking about this, I wondered not only about how the topic of animal research evoked discomfort, but how the Mass Observation Project itself might have contributed to these feelings. So we might consider, as suggested earlier, whether using methods such as the Mass Observation Project to solicit writing on sensitive topics like animal research might represent an intrusion or invasion of the personal domestic space with unsettling moral quandaries and leave participants alone at home with emotionally and morally troubling thoughts and feelings. Although many correspondents draw on other people around them in their writing, are some mass observers left isolated in engaging with different topics? Thinking about the mass observer identity and expectations of serious engagements with topics that might be part of this, might there be a burden placed on observers to respond to topics they find unsettling, even if there's no formal obligation for them to respond to each directive? As touched on in my analysis of the writing on animal research, it appeared that some mass observers felt negatively about not being able to write about the topic. Of course, there are two sides to this, and the Mass Observation Project offers methodological benefits which might actually make correspondents more comfortable in responding to sensitive issues. The MOP offers time and space for correspondents to reflect on and articulate themselves away from the researcher, alleviating pressures to respond in the moment and in the direct judgment of another. Although, of course, we should also note that there are important relationships between observers and archivists and researchers which shape their writing And as Annabella Pollen has written about, mass observers may reflect on not only how a topic has been constructed and their own views towards it, but also on how their writing might be interpreted by an imagined reader and what uses might be made from their writing. Another way in which the Mass Observation Project might put its correspondents at ease is by enabling them to skip past certain sections of the directive or to not respond altogether, with the anonymity of the panel perhaps lessening the anxieties of doing so. Though, as discussed in the previous slide, this might be complicated by expectations built into the mass observer identity. Also complicating concerns around the potential isolation in responding to difficult topics, mass observers may often discuss their directive topics with others, and so we might think about the writing process as a shared rather than solitary endeavour. And finally, as feminist sociologists have long argued, notions of the home as the manifestation of public-private divide or as a space of respite are themselves far from unproblematic, and so the idea that the MO might be an intrusion into the home isn't that simple. So to give some final questions more than anything, I think that for us, perhaps a starting point is to outwardly acknowledge the difficulty of engaging with certain topics. So for instance, one example of this I came across was in a public engagement survey on the topic of multi-species dementia. So building care for the well-being of participants into the method itself, the survey, which was undertaken by the Multi-Species Dementia International Research Network, acknowledges on its first page that some people can find answering questions about dementia or the use of animals upsetting, and it advises those who are likely to find these topics upsetting against participating. As well as this, the survey included temperature checks, pop-up questions which ask the participant if they're experiencing any distress as a result of taking part in the survey, and clicking yes to any of these questions would end the survey and dispose of any recorded information. Such an approach displays recognition of the effectual strain that engagement with such topics can take, and might take some pressure off participants who may feel negatively, as some mass observers in the directive I analysed expressed, if they are unable to cope with discussing sensitive topics. Yet, given that any topic could be sensitive to someone, should mass observers be able to opt out of certain topics? Perhaps there are certain triggers that some correspondents may wish to avoid and could disclose to the archive. And what does discomfort mean for the shared ownership of mass observation? Dorothy Sheridan has written that there is an element of possessiveness or ownership in the attitude to the project on the part of the correspondent. The correspondents feel themselves to be genuinely participants. It is also their project, and they are entitled to criticise. Therefore, we might further examine what this shared ownership means for the sharing of responsibility around engaging with unsettling topics and sharing the discomfort. So to end, I think ultimately, for the important richness and diversity of issues that mass observation deals with, recognising the value of discomfort and not seeking to sanitise or simplify topics which are inherently complex and challenging perhaps, means that instead of circumventing discomfort from arising, perhaps most important for us is to cultivate methods which make uncomfortable discussions manageable. Some references that I've used in my talk to acknowledge my funders, my institution, and of course, mass observation and the mass observers themselves. And then finally to end with a comforting picture of my two cats, Marty and Ethel, and to say a big thank you for listening. I'll stop sharing. There we go.
Thank you, Renelle. That was great. That was really, so many questions there about transparency and the kind of sense of, what the whole project of mass observation is and how we go about kind of social research and kind of ideas. Should everything actually be, attendable to? And with that in mind, I want to move on to Nina Lockwood. We'll be back to you in a bit, Renelle.
Thank you.
So Nina Lockwood's been working with Susie Scott on a project around, and it's just absolutely kind of intrigues me, on nothingness, and to think about all those things that don't actually kind of exist or kind of seem to be kind of part of your life, but actually are kind of hugely important to your life. You know, the things that didn't happen, the things you don't have. Anyway, I won't go on about that because that's her project. Nina is a research fellow at in the School of Law, Politics and Sociology, and the paper is called Narratives of Nothing: Avoidance, Resistance and Refusal. Over to you, Nina.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you. Also, thank you, Renelle. That was such an interesting talk. That, like Ben said, there are points already that I'm thinking, oh, I hope that maybe together we can carry forward discussions at the end. Yeah, thank you, it's great. Just the kind of points that I'd like to make is that apologies on behalf of Susie Scott, because she was hoping to co-present with me today, but because of changes to her teaching schedule, that hasn't been possible, which is a shame because I know she's looking forward to it. Anyway, I will try my best to kind of faithfully deliver what we hope to speak about together. So let me share my screen first of all. Also, can I just check with Ben and Kirsty? I think I got from Kirsty a message saying that we're okay to speak for half an hour rather than the 20 minutes. Is that right? Okay, okay. There are bits that I might leave to one side that we can go back to in questions if we want. Okay. Okay. I'm just going to get rid of my face. So continuing basically with today's theme on mass observers' responses to basically what was being construed as difficult or uncomfortable questions, I'm going to present an aspect of a paper that Susie and I wrote, which is entitled here, Saying Something with Nothing. It basically considers how mass observers decline to respond to our Commission directive on narratives of nothing, basically nothing and the road not taken. Basically, for context, the findings centre on one element of one study that forms part of a larger project, which sits within a still broader programme research that is developing the sociology of nothing. I'll return to the sociology of nothing in a little moment to try and contextualise the findings that I present here. Anyway, but first, not wishing to bypass what feels like a rich opportunity for shared thinking through, I'm just going to ask you if you would spend a couple of minutes reading our directive, or at least the bits I've lifted out for brevity, and note possibly your initial responses, because this might prove interesting when we flash forward to things we talk about that are potentially raised through as a consequence of the rest of what I present. So I'll read this small bit, which was the main element to our directive, which was part of the autumn directive in 2020. It says, nothing on the road not taken. We would like to hear about what you experience as absent or missing from your life. This might be a memory of something you once didn't say or do, something you've been unable to do or prevented from having, a choice you made to turn down an opportunity, a life event that hasn't happened to you, or something, someone you wished had been present. You may feel a range of positive or negative emotions about this lost experience, sadness, regret, anger, envy, but also happiness, pride, or relief. Please tell us about whatever mixture of feelings come up when you reflect back over your personal experience of nothing. We appreciate that you might find this an emotive theme, so please take your time in responding. Below are some suggestions about the types of things you could write about, and then it says we ask them not to write about COVID-19 because that forms the other part. I'm not going to read all of these, but it gives you a flavour of some of the suggestions that were given as a, I don't know, a landscape of possibilities of things that people might be prompted to then think about and reflect on their experiences or non-experiences. Okay. So, as a bit of background, the sociology of nothing is essentially the contextual foundation to this whole programme of research. Its initial development is has its kind of origins in sociological debates, basically, on the biased or, you know, predominant tilt towards focusing on marked versus unmarked patterns in behaviour. Marked being the unusual or the extreme, the exotic, the unexpected. Unmarked are the counterpoint to these marked phenomena, and relate to the more everyday, the mundane, possibly, depending on how you construe it. Related to this is the process of reverse marking, where figure ground patterns or normative figure ground patterns are shifted, inverted, and what would usually be unmarked becomes the point of focal interest. Basically, the sociology of nothing is defined partially and foundationally by a shift in the in focus, by looking at what is empirically absent or unreal or hasn't been experienced or is lost or missing, away from what is empirically present, has been experienced, is real, has happened in one's life. Okay, so what forms the focus of interest for us is what we could construe in terms of negative symbolic social objects: non-things, nobodies, non-events, and nowhere places. Our programme of research is interested in exploring the phenomenology of lost experiences and unlived lives, how people retrospectively perceive subjectively significant losses or absences throughout their life course. This represents a move away from traditional kind of approaches to narrative identity that focus on positive formation, stories of becoming, who we are because of the events that have happened, the people we have met, the things we've done, words spoken, and so forth. Instead, we're interested in what we conceptualize of stories of unbecoming. Through reverse biographical identity work, we focus on things that are missed or lost, chosen against, foreclosed, or simply events that have never happened. I will now outline, in fact, first, it's important to kind of acknowledge within the broader programme of research, there has been a kind of shift. We're interested in the phenomenology and how people subjectively make sense of these lost experiences and unlived lives, which moves away from what began as a symbolic interactionist lens through which people's experiences of absences and loss were interpreted. We're now adopting a more of a hermeneutical, phenomenological stance, and this maps onto the transition between what was Project 1 and now is Project 2. So very briefly, Project 1 was devised and carried out by Susie Scott alone between 2017 and 2019. The data from this preliminary project was gathered online and basically forms the basis of what evolved into being Project 2, which received funding by the Leverhulme Trust. Project 1 was based on 28 personal accounts collected, as I said, online, and these were thematically analysed, and themes that were salient throughout were lost opportunities, silences, invisibility, notions of emptiness and stillness. And if I just switch back, they form the basis of Susie's book on the social life of nothing. Okay. The epistemological shift that has taken place between Project 1 and Project 2 basically reflects a recalibration of the temporal lens we're looking through. By zooming out, we're inviting people to reflect beyond snapshot single events or episodes that could be talked about in terms of Bramberg's small stories. Instead, what we want to do is look at a much more broader panoramic view, looking at life horizons and what are conceptualized often as big stories. The Mass Observation Archive and its writers have been integral to all three main phases of data collection that form or are nested within Project 2. They're listed here. You can see where we did initially a secondary data analysis of 46 responses from 7 purposefully selected past directives. That was our first phase of data collection, and the second phase being the Commission directive itself, which forms the basis of today. Following on from that, we have, in fact, very recently, I have conducted 20 interviews, life story interviews with mass observers who responded to our directive. Throughout each of these phases of data collection, we've conducted a narrative analysis, or rather we will, because the interviews at the moment are in the process of being transcribed. And I think actually I might have a couple more bonus ones that are scheduled for the near future. So turning now to basically the focal focus of today and the findings on which I want to focus. All that follows sits very solidly within the narrative field of inquiry, and therefore explicitly recognises that related qualitative methods involve communicative and performative acts of storytelling. These relational processes of dialogue inform the transactional exchange of hermeneutic knowledge. Participants compose accounts of lived experience, which are interpreted by researchers as the audience. In this respect, autobiographical life writing mirrors the process of relational psychotherapy, a joint attempt of making sense of biographical self-identity. Likewise, it's a situated encounter between participant and researcher. This involves phenomenological processes of mutual perception, things Renelle talked about, that kind of Pollan's reference to mutual imaginaries and intersubjective reflexivity. Clearly, whatever stories are presented and emerge and are then taken to be the findings of research only represent one story and one way in which we are deciphering a text. So this raises important questions of what other alternative versions of narrative truth might lie beneath the surface. For every tale that is told, there are endless, infinite array of unspoken, unheard stories that could reveal additional sides to the spoken story or the written account. Researchers possibly, I'd argue definitely, have an ethical imperative to listen to the meaning in these latent and tacit messages. So we asked ourselves, what is being dialogically communicated by those mass observers who declined to engage with our task as part of the directive on nothing and the road not taken? The subset of our sample that what I'm about to show focuses on is taken from 29 of what ended up being 220 responses to our directive. Of these 29, 17 were women, 12 men, ages range from 35 to 90 years, and the mean age was 60. Through our narrative analysis, we inductively identified 3 broad patterns of disengagement from this written task, which we have given the terms refusal, avoidance, and resistance. Interesting to note that Renelle made some references to some similar terminology. So the first pattern of non-response, refusing to answer. We construe this in terms of being an act of commission. What I mean by that is that it expresses a conscious decision not to engage with the task. This decision is articulated with reference to a range of seemingly rational reasons that provide, explanations for disengagement. What also is communicated through this refusal was an understanding of the mass observers who responded in this way that they were transgressing a normative code of conduct and the situational properties of the research relationship. They understood that they had been asked something, as each directive does, and that they were choosing not to respond. Their justification can be taken as an accounting procedure, which essentially functions to disavow the attribution of a deviant identity, not to be construed in a potentially negative light. And attendant to that it delivers identity claims of belonging by aligning with shared moral codes. There is something that is also worth interesting in noting throughout each of the cases where people refused to respond to the directive, is that they seem to demonstrate a skewed interpretation of our directive towards negative bias, something that I'll return to later, possibly in questions, because I'm interested in people's thoughts on this. Tends to be a point that has come up consistently throughout every phase of this project too thus far. So here are some illustrative examples of cases where people expressed a refusal to answer our directive. So Lavender said, "I believe that someone is watching over me. My apology, and all will eventually be well. My apologies that I can't answer this properly. I've had so much to be thankful for in my life that writing at length about having missed out on something is problematic, self-indulgent. I know that compared to others less fortunate, I have no reason to dwell on what might have been." It's a comment from Percy. Martin, however, said, "The directive presupposes that we may uselessly wish that there were different outcome. Why would I wish to consider any part of my life as problematic?" And then finally, here is an illustration. We have Hetty, who says, "Your idea of calling it nothing is very ill named, I think. Nothing evokes many things and is used in many contexts, but not the one you are after." Okay. So this gives a select illustration of a range of refusal responses. As you can see at the beginning, it's a very polite, apologetic tone to things, as is the case in Lavender. Whereas if we looked at the example from Hetty, this has got a much kind of hints at or arguably explicitly communicates a frustration with what is being asked. And this raises a number of questions, not least our interest and me in people's apparent reading of the directive in terms of it being focused on regret and being principally interested in sad tales and negative emotions associated with such tales. So a little bit more expansion on our tentative interpretations of the such refusals to answer. We adopt a psychoanalytic lens and argue that there is the possibility to conceptualize this refusal in terms of projection, which is a defensive mechanism involving the attribution of one's feelings to others. Is it the case that something was stirred and evoked complicated, possibly negative emotional experiences when surveying the landscape of a life, and that then mass observers projected that onto the directive in a much more kind of singular way, and then in that way felt whatever, that would be a speculation too far, but this is one way of considering why the reasoning or the experience that might underpin the refusal to engage with the task. Adopting a more phenomenological lens suggests that possibly habits, routines, expectations and conventional frames provide an understanding of people's reading of the directive in terms of it being looking for regretful tales, sorry tales, sad tales. The poetic motif of the road not taken by Frost evokes feelings of wistfulness and nostalgia and sorrow. And it seems that there are parative normative connotations associated with the road not taken. Okay, so the second pattern of non-responding or limited responding we kind of term as avoidance. This is a more subtle form of non-response, something that we construe in terms of omission rather than conscious, active refusal and rejection of the task. What seems to be apparent across people who responded in ways that seemed avoidant is there is an initial appearance of compliance. There is an expression of considered engagement with the topic and reflections on its wider social value. However, when turning to reflect on the relevance of the directive and any salient or subjectively significant personal experiences that related to what the directive called for, respondents drew a blank. You could argue that symbolic objects of relevance were inaccessible or out of awareness, that in reflecting over the life course thus far, individuals taking this hindsight view could see no focal figures on the horizon for them and just an empty space instead. Emissive non-responders do not consciously, as I said, reject, dismiss or refuse the prospect of tangible non-experience, but instead they feel kind of more passive and lacking and deficient and unconnected to these potential objects. Basically, without any substance to remark on, they admissively practice what we call as non-saying rather than not saying. It seems to be the case that they feel they have nothing to say. Here is a couple of examples again of what we coded as avoiding the call to respond. I have thought about this topic for some time and find it very difficult to comment, says Lavender. And then Philip said, this isn't an easy concept to get my head around. I've given it 2 days thinking about to get this far, my opening paragraph. While Sandra says, I confess that faced with this task, my mind is continuously drawing a blank. Okay. So, as is evident with those illustrations, meta-communicative comments and statements characterize each of them. They focus on the experience of writing rather than articulating relevant personal content. And we tentatively suggest that something else might be going on here at a level of intrapersonal process. These meta-communicative statements seem to function to create a distance between the author and their text. They foreground the immediate situation of the task at hand, rather than, and somewhat conceal possibly the historical past. Again, we tentatively interpret this in a number of ways. Conceptualizations of this obstructed intrapersonal process, this blockage possibly to experiences of non-doing, non-events, nowhere places, non-happening, lost, missing experiences, can be construed in terms of psychodynamic unconscious and a block to this. Similarly, it could be a disconnection between the experiencing self and the remembering self. The experiencing self having of the then, back then, when the experience happened, and the remembering selves, the person as they're narrating and responding in their written account. Again, there's a further way of interpreting this in relation to an interruption of self-relational dialogue. This sits more within existential thinking about the confrontation of what we might not have experienced and how that sits with us, and the potentially emotionally evocative nature of considering and engaging with not only our doings, but our non-doings and unlived experiences throughout the course of our lives. Okay. There was some further detail that I just wanted to mention briefly about the pattern of avoiding the call to responding to the directive. And this shows it highlights three different forms of this nested within this overarching theme of avoidance. The first is respondents adopted a non-subjective position. They referred to collective or universal standpoints rather than individual views. As you can see, Bertie here says, we only have one life and any other possibilities are imaginary. For all of us, there are things that have turned out well or badly or not happened at all. But once they've happened or not, we go on living our actual lives, not the might have been life. Okay. Another way that people expressed or communicated their avoidance was through abstract reasoning. They did this by making reference to morals, ideological positions, political debates, or philosophical wisdom. Again, this takes the focus away from their own individual subjective lives and extrapolates things and talks about it from a much more distanced, generic, ideologically informed, abstract view. Differently to this, a few people reverse marked and transposed what they were asked to do. What I mean by this is they flipped the lens back to lived experiences rather than lost or unlived experiences. They seem to express that they're engaging with the task, showed a conscientious commitment in their writing to grappling with things. And then what they did was they began telling stories that said what they had done, what they had experienced in their life, how they did identify, almost leading one to think that then they were going to suggest the reverse, or it was a way into doing something that would speak more directly to the task of speaking to non-experienced, but that didn't happen at all. So there are just a few where there was almost a surface level compliance, but then when it came to them actually reflecting on experiences of a personal nature, they flipped it round again and did it and answered what could be termed the normative way of storing one's life by outlining things they had done and how they felt about those. Okay. So the final pattern of non-responding we termed resisting the process or resistance. And this is a rather more ambivalent position. It seems to be characterized by confused, inconsistent, and a dynamic kind of patterns of non-response. Unlike the other two forms of non-responding, there was an absence of expressions of conscious intentions towards the task, but there was an absence also of a clear and distinct unidirectional stance. Basically, there was illustrations of vacillating between engaging and withdrawal, push and pull, approach, retreat, that are indicative possibly of experienced ambivalence. Ambivalence is a psychosocial relational state involving mixed and often polarized and contradictory emotions towards symbolic objects or other experiences. It poses complications, and it's difficult to emotionally reconcile a disjunct between competing feelings, and this can create feelings of frustration, confusion, agitation, as storytellers vacillate between alternative attitudinal positions. Ambivalence of this kind also challenges narrative sense making. There isn't a coherent, linear, or even other patterns, response and single threads to a story of one's life. There's something multi-textured, mixed and murkier that seems to prompt complication to or a resistance to wanting to engage with this such reflections. Having said this, argument could be that the conclusions that storytellers come to through engaging and with ambivalence that they might be experiencing, whilst phenomenologically more disappointing, gives us a more genuine and accurate understanding of people's lives and their lived experiences. And just to finish here, it's potentially indicative of intrapersonal process of self-relational dialogue. As in previous pattern of avoidance, there is something possibly going on here where there is something very confronting about the task that we put to the mass observers. That it is an emotionally evocative or potentially emotionally evocative directive to consider and reflect on one's experiences of non-doing and things that haven't happened or might be experiences absent and missing in their lives. Again, there are different patterns of expression of this resisting process that can be broken down into hesitancy, restraint, and recoiling and retreat. Hesitancy seemed to occur at the anticipation of telling at the beginning of the written accounts. Accounts were prefaced with further metacommunicative statements about feelings of reluctance, feeling unready, uncertain, a sense of trepidation. Meryl said, "It has taken me such a long time to write about this first part. There have been several aborted attempts over the last 3 months." Sorry, just moving you, Ben, I can't see my thing. "To the point that I thought I may have to put this down as a non-event. The irony in this quite amusing." Secondly, there was restraint. That was demonstrated in the act of telling. There was again surface level kind of engagement and a kind of communication of compliance. But this potentially hints at a false self, acting as a protective shield to the ontological insecurity of a core self. And it operates interpersonally between the writer and the researcher, and intrapersonally through internal dialogue. We consider this in terms of the human condition and freedom of choice that we have, that defines our existence, and the vertigo of possibilities that's kind of lay before us. There's something about the potential that respondents not only wanted to shield themselves from knottier, more difficult, challenging reflections themselves, but also to possibly hide away and remove themselves from the scene of their writing with, again, as Renelle spoke about, the idea of the audience in mind, not only researchers or people directly at the Mass Observation Archive, but who knows who is going to come and access the information there, and who is going to use that material or read it in certain ways. There is something about wanting to remain hidden, or the possibility of wanting to remain hidden, that raises a number of questions. Finally, there's recoiling and retreat. This is a kind of further metacommunicative reporting on experience that demonstrates cases and an appreciation of the likelihood of the emotional impact of the topic. There are signs of sincere attempts to respond to the task, yet characterized by moments of halting, abandoning, or leaving it incomplete. There were occasions, too lengthy to detail today, where respondents would begin an endeavour to relay a lost or missing experience in their life that had personal significance, only to stop and meta-reflect that it was all too much for them, that they couldn't continue, and that they were very sorry, or just to abruptly finish. Yes, I think that covers that. Okay, what's happened there? Okay, thank you. Sorry, my key wasn't working. So to review, as I said at the outset, we need to remember that qualitative research and narrative inquiry of this kind is a polyvocal conversation. There's widespread consensus on the dialogical relation and contextually embedded quality to narrative practices in hermeneutic inquiry. But equally, qualitative researchers, narratologists, historians, archivists, social researchers in general seem to speak of a requirement to engage in making sense of the dialogical patterns and communicative dynamics that take place within research settings. And what we've done here is try to respond to this call by considering the rhetorical dimensions of participants' non-responses to our task on a topic that is admittedly emotive, focusing on lost, absent and missing experiences. Again, it's worth holding in mind the notion of mutual imaginaries that we co-create with our writers, folding in what we bring to the table that speaks to the kind of hermeneutic and double hermeneutic that is characteristic of this kind of endeavour. Again, I've already made reference to that mass observers are aware of the wider audience and the consequences of data use, that once they have committed their response to the directives to the archive, it is then free to be perceived and read in whatever way it is chosen by readers, researchers. Again, it's important, this is kind of covered already, in the blind spots of interpretive bias, through that folding. What don't we see as researchers? What don't we want to see as researchers potentially, and how we need to reflexively engage in a meaningful way with this. Similarly, the perpetual provisionality of stories mean that the meanings and the findings that we tentatively speculate over are never the final story. They're just one of an infinite array, as I began at the beginning saying, of stories that could be spoken. There is another thing that I've just put in here because I was interested in, or Susan, I'm interested in this, and it's something that was come to mind from an epistemological engagement with reflecting on what we're doing, is our act of collecting this data, bringing these stories into existence, and they're just an artifact of the methodological approach that we've taken. Winnie, there's an example here, says, although I've been reflecting on instances of my life, both positive and negative, the problem I have is that I'm not convinced that I feel any really important to me. Would I be thinking about them if I hadn't been prompted to trawl through memories in an attempt to find something to write about? So do these things come into existence in people's minds only because of our inquiry or similar other inquiries, whereas otherwise they're things that would have not become consciously apparent in the mindscape and the horizon of a person's lived life. Similarly, there are questions over narrative power and the ethics and politics of retelling other stories, and how does this sit within the particular context of the Mass Observation Archive? I think I'll leave it there. There are a number of questions that I have for Renelle that I wonder if they speak to things that might be glaringly